We're really excited tonight to be partnering with Lawrence Wishart Books to celebrate this new edition of Claudia Jones, A Life in Exile by Marika Sherwood. Jumanah Younis will be chatting to Jade Bentil and Lola Olufemi about the life of the visionary and pioneering Claudia Jones, particularly focusing on her time in Britain. Jade Bentil is a Black feminist historian and PhD researcher at the University of Oxford. Her scholarship uses oral history methodologies to center the experience of women and African and African Caribbean descent in Britain and their long history of feminist activism. Jade's debut book, Rebel Citizen, uses oral history interviews and will be hopefully coming out pretty soon from Allen and Lane, and we're really excited about that. Lola Olufemi is a Black feminist writer and organizer from London. She's the author of Experiments in Imagining Otherwise and Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. She was shortlisted for the 2020 Queen Mary Wasafiri Writing Prize in Fiction and is currently researching for a PhD with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We're really, really glad to have both Lola and Jade with us tonight. And Jumanah is books editor at Lawrence Wishart and the creator of the Radical Black Women series. And this Claudia Jones biography is the first book in that series, I believe. In the past, she's worked as a freelance writer, translator, and editor, and she's written for publications including The Guardian, Red Pepper, and the LRB blog, rather. I'm so sorry. There's a Q&A box to post your questions as well as a chat, and we'd really appreciate any questions and comments that you have for our speakers throughout the event. If you feel like tweeting, we are on Twitter at Housmans Books, and I'm going to hand over to our speakers now, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alice. Wonderful introduction and for the bios of our panelists tonight. I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I'm going to dive right in with a question for Lola about Claudia Jones as a communist. I think it's one of the really exciting things about bringing this book out again at this particular moment in time, when it feels like kind of Marxism is kind of back on the agenda and people are really excited by Marxist ideas. Obviously, Claudia Jones was a very active member of the Communist Party in the US, where she grew up. And it's her activities as a communist that resulted in her being exiled from the US to Britain. You said something in your preface about Claudia's political activism being glossed over when people write about her often. I think in particular in relation to her time in the UK and thinking about Carnival and the kind of arts events that she was involved in. What aspect of her political life do you find most exciting to reclaim?
Thank you for that question, Jumanah. I first want to say a big thank you to Housmans as well for giving us a platform to have this conversation. I think for me, what was so great about being asked to write the preface and to sit and reflect on Claudia's life is precisely what you were talking about. I was really interested in what drew her to being part of the Communist Party of Great Britain and also the Communist Youth League. I think for me, what's most exciting about her political life, or what was most kind of threatening, was her ability to critique and her place on the left in kind of making interventions into communist, Marxist-Leninist spaces to demand that Black women workers be not just included, but be central to an analysis of exploitation under capitalism. Like I think of her essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of Negro Women, which she published in 1914, where she makes this really astute critique based on what I just said. And I think that reading it now, going back and engaging with it, not only would people call it, a precursor to ideas like intersectionality, etc., a lot more radical. But I think the heart of that essay is her militancy and her understanding that her allegiance to Black women workers wasn't based on, a liberal identity politics. It was based on the threat that they could pose to the bourgeoisie, And I think that also extends to other aspects of her political life that I find really exciting, like things like the West Indian Gazette. The founding of that and the 7-year run of that newspaper for me was one of the best, I think, attempts we've seen at diasporic political education and or mobilization of people, through an understanding that you could cultivate a mass audience and you could also speak to people about the issues that were happening in their communities. I think that the last thing I'll say, I guess, about her is that her work was so internationalist. I think she was known in so many different quarters of the world. Just to give an idea of like the range of groups that she worked with, like she worked with the Indian Workers Association, the World Campaign to Free South African Political Prisoners, the African National Congress. It goes on. And to have to do that, I think, against the backdrop of suspicion about communism and against the backdrop of like McCarthyism in particular, that like not only limited who she could see, where she could travel. I think for me, that shows a real like a real understanding that she knew that we are all implicated in kind of global chains of exploitation, right? And it will take, you know, a kind of a politics that isn't bounded by the nation in order to defeat that.
Thanks, Lola. What a brilliant introduction to Claudia Jones. Jade, I can see you nodding a lot. Is there anything you want to contribute on this point?
I feel like Lola has like said it all. That's why I was like nodding my head because I was just like, yes, you know. I think what Lola kind of highlights, well, has highlighted so beautifully, like just now, but also in the preface, is the kind of neutralizing of Claudia's politics that has kind of taken place over the past kind of like half a century or so, where we've kind of got Claudia kind of prefigured as, you know, the mother of carnival, but the political organizing, the forms of collectivity, the types of kind of knowledge exchange and production that were happening at a grassroots level have definitely kind of been smudged from the record. So I think, you know, the kind of republication of this book, and us even kind of just having this conversation and having seen the series and, you know, the conversations that are kind of taking place, I think is a really beautiful testament to the kind of politics that Claudia was forming, both in the US and when she was exiled in Britain. So yeah, just kind of excited to be part of the conversation and kind of see where it goes. Thanks,
Jade. And you made reference to the series, and obviously the series as a whole is sort of designed to try and reclaim the political lives of Black women activists who've been so significant in British radical movement history. I know that you're working on an oral history project at the moment with African and African-Caribbean women. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that, because I suppose when I was thinking about this period, you know, Claudia arrives in the UK in 1955, and she immediately starts to advocate for the rights of West Indian workers who are experiencing discrimination. So in a way, I'm wondering if some of these women may have been her contemporaries who you're interviewing, and if you could maybe sketch a little bit kind of what you've discovered about what life was like for them at that time.
Sure. So yeah, I'm kind of working at the kind of tail end-ish on a kind of book project at the moment that looks at the kind of everyday forms of resistance and rebellion that were being kind of cultivated and instituted by African and Caribbean women migrants who migrated following the Second World War to Britain. So in the period that is kind of commonly referred to as the Windrush period, but I'm kind of trying to, I guess, understand that period outside of that specific kind of historical and kind of nationalistic framing. So, you know, I've spoken to about, I would say 30 or so, maybe a bit more, women who kind of migrated here from about 1948 to 1981. So there's a kind of like a myriad of like different experiences that are kind of being navigated within these oral histories. You know, I spoke to one woman who traveled from Ghana in 1948, months before the Windrush kind of arrival, kind of complicating that sort of dominant timeline of like Black migration to the UK. In terms of contemporaries of Claudia Jones, I haven't actually kind of come across anyone who was specifically kind of organizing at the same time. However, I've, you know, spoken to so many women who were kind of impacted in so many different ways by the many kind of material entanglements that Black women were facing and that kind of Claudia was speaking to at the time. So things like the, you know, the 1962 Commonwealth kind of Act that happened that Claudia organized against, where, you know, the kind of rules in terms of migration to the UK from so-called Commonwealth kind of nations was changed in accordance with the kind of whims of the state. You know, you've got women who later discovered, you know, after that and kind of successive Commonwealth and nationality bills and laws, that they actually weren't citizens and, you know, they were kind of living, you know, I guess, without the kind of protection, so to speak, of citizenship in the UK, which they found out much later. So yeah, it has kind of been interesting to kind of speak to different women, just to kind of listen to, I guess, a more, I guess the best term would be mundane experience of kind of racism in this country. What I really wanted to do with the book was kind of speak to women who weren't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily be seen as kind of activists or political actors, but in their kind of everyday lives were kind of instituting these kind of forms of resistance, whether that looked like kind of, you know, different forms of reproductive justice, different kind of alternative forms of like mothering and kind of relationships, in terms of queerness, in terms of transness. So just kind of looking at these different ways that Black women were navigating British society, but also putting that in conversation with a larger diasporic form of rebellion that, you know, was kind of taking shape in both the Caribbean and Africa at the same time. So yeah, just kind of trying to center those ideas and those kind of theories of collectivity, of internationalism that were at the center of Claudia's politics.
Fantastic. I really like that you used the word mundane, and it made me think of something, and the kind of the way you're highlighting these everyday experiences and everyday women, I guess, in a way, you know, people who aren't really talked about in as being particularly heroic for the things that they did. It reminds me of something, Lola, that you say in the preface about the kind of hidden bureaucracy of living, and how I wanted to kind of pick up on that in thinking about how you both use queer theory as a tool in your research on Black women's history. Because it seemed to me, and I think we've spoken about this probably before, Lola, that, you know, that messiness of relationship is very much at the heart of kind of how I think of kind of using a queer lens. So I wondered if you might be up for speaking about that.
Yeah, I think that what queer methodologies maybe offer, or I guess in relation to the archive specifically, is a new mode of seeing. I think of like what Munoz tells us about how queerness is that thing that makes us realize that this world is not enough. And I think in relation to the archive, queer methodologies can help us think of like cultural objects or think of archival material in a way that isn't static. Like the past becomes kind of tactile in you know, how we approach it and how we engage with it. I think that for me, like this question of like messiness, it's interesting that you bring that up in relation to Claudia, because I think a life that was so weaved, you know, beyond borders is bound to be messy. And I think what's really kind of interesting about this book, and I say in the preface, is that it's kind of littered, when you read it, it's littered with holes and gaps and omissions, and you can see where differing accounts come to a head, where that contention is. And I think that that's incredibly important in the task of attempting to remember someone or giving an account of one's life, right? It shows us the limitations of that kind of project. And so when we're thinking about Claudia, we can't imagine, I think, hand in hand with that neutralizing of her politics is a desire to kind of deify. And I think it's really important I was struck when reading the book to understand like sometimes the misery of her condition and how isolated she was, how often she was relying on other people for money. Often there were fights around, in terms of the West Indian Gazette, the political leaning of the paper or what positions they took on XYZ issue. And so I think what a queer methodology allows is for us to approach this history with playfulness and with invention in mind, rather than a static retelling of Claudia's life as if it progressed in a neat and linear way. I think, you know, anyone engaged in any sort of grassroots organizing knows the competing histories that plague it always. And so, and in any task of excavation, that has to be central to how we, you know, engage with the material, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead, Jade.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, I really love this idea of messiness. And it's kind of something that I, you know, had to kind of contend with over the course of writing the book as well, just in terms of the fact that, you know, people are complicated. People are really complicated. I think sometimes, not necessarily now, but definitely in my kind of younger years, that kind of idea of deification, these kind of like great figures who have these great histories and you can kind of map them neatly and it all kind of comes together, was really central to my idea of kind of like a historical project, because that is what history, you know, kind of does typically, you know, capital H history, in terms of how we're being taught it. I think like a queer methodology undoes that kind of sense of teleological project that is kind of this, you know, slow march of progress towards, in a really straight line towards this idea of, you know, I guess I wouldn't even say freedom is the right word, this idea that we are kind of perfecting society, you know. So I think, you know, sitting down with the different people that I've spoken to and kind of just listening to the messiness of their lives, the contradictions as well, the times where they look back and they're like, actually, I wouldn't do that now, or actually, I think that was a mistake, or this is what I did because of the particular kind of social and political limitations that I was faced with, has been really, really important. And I think especially when, you know, we're talking about Black women, that kind of stretch between kind of deification and, you know, on the other side, dehumanization, that seems to be the kind of two options that we're faced with. But for me, I think it's been really important to kind of hold together, you know, our capacity for love and our capacity for harm as well in these narratives, and how that also kind of is part of the long history of like a Black radical tradition as well, those kind of messy entanglements where nothing is really neat. You know, I really, when I was kind of reading the preface, I was really struck by Lola kind of talking about the fact that, you know, Claudia didn't even have a passport when she came to Britain. You know, she had this kind of internationalist politic, of course, you know, because of the different kind of forms of, you know, state predation that she was navigating, and also the kind of circumstances of those that she loved, those around her, those that she was in community with. But, you know, this woman who is kind of revered couldn't actually leave the country at a certain point. So, you know, just kind of trying to hold those things together and kind of understand, kind of understand how people kind of arrived at the positions that they arrived at, the kind of the cost of that as well, you know, the political cost, the cost to her health, you know, premature death, I think is really important. I think queer theorizations allow us to kind of complicate time in really interesting ways, you know, so kind of what does that politic of, you know, Claudia in 1955, you know, Claudia organizing and, you know, bringing together the West Indian Gazette, what does that mean to us now? How does that speak to us now? I think is, yeah, a really interesting provocation.
Thank you. Yeah, I really, I'm so into this conversation because this is like really, I find it so interesting editing this series to think about these things, because it's what's coming up again and again with the authors I'm working with, who are doing research on the archives of Amy Ashford Garvey, of Girl in Bean and the Brixton Black Women's Group, who are coming up time and time again against these contradictions, against these huge gaps, and thinking creatively actually about how to work with that, how to play with that, what it brings up for them. as Black women researchers, and I think that that's such an exciting process. I feel really privileged to be a part of. So I suppose we've talked a little bit about Claudia. We've talked about Claudia as a political activist in the Communist Party, but she was also involved in setting up quite a number of alliances and organisations in her time, though not many of them survived her or that long necessarily, or they overlapped. But the period following her death did see quite a burst of activity in Black radical circles in Britain, thinking of the Black Unity and Freedom Party, the Black Liberation Front, movements like that, and also the Black women's movement. And I was wondering if either of you wanted to speak to kind of a legacy that might have been inherited from Claudia indirectly by those movements, if that's something that's come up in your work or that you'd be interested to think about.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think about what Gail Lewis says about Black feminism being a project of ethical relation. And I think that to me, that's a clear, she's writing as part of a clear inheritance from Claudia and others who marked that path, right? Whose lives were lived in service of others, but whose lives were lived, I think, also with the aim of creating, more livable conditions, creating conditions that enabled people to see the links between the exploitation of the working class in Britain and the super exploitation of workers in the colonies. For me, I think when we look at the history also of the Brixton Black Women's Group, or of OAD, we see in their internationalism a real movement away from the politics of the women's liberation movement, which in places was in this country incredibly bounded and nationally specific, towards interest and a desire for connection for people, feminists who were working on the African continent, those who were engaged in Pan-African struggles for independence and so on. And so for me, the question of legacy is one that's bound in where do people's priorities lie? And it's clear that what they inherited was Claudia's kind of wandering eye, her tendency to not remain kind of located in one place. And if she couldn't move, then her words could move, then her understanding of the world could also travel. I think also we see how a critique of capitalism remains central to the most threatening movements. So many of the people in those groups that I just mentioned were Marxists, were Marxist-Leninists, or were at least in the politics that they espoused, anti-imperialist. And that's something that the directness and the clearness of that language, I think, is often lost in grassroots kind of mobilizations today, some of them, not all. But I think I've been kind of, maybe a bit of a tangent, looking at the archives in the Feminist Library, and they have a lot of material from the paper Outright, which was like a group of women of color who came together who with the specific aim of creating an internationalist newspaper that was freely available, that was something like ATP, that ran throughout the 80s. And yeah, that to me, like seeing how if you go from issue to issue, they want to point out what's happening in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Ghana, etc. That's their kind of longing is for that connection outward. I can't help but think of Claudia Jones as ushering in that orientation.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, kind of alongside that sense of internationalism, that sense of anti-imperialism and kind of Marxism, is the kind of centrality of political education that I think was, at the heart of so much of Claudia's organizing, kind of speaking to like all of the different women that, Lola just mentioned. you know, when you kind of speak to them, they always say, you know, when we kind of came together to form like Brixton Black Women's Group, one of the first things we did was set up like a reading group in the back of, you know, Sabar Bookshop in Brixton, and get together every Sunday. We sat down with Marx, we sat down with all of these kind of different social and political treaties, and, you know, read them together, you know, critiqued them, had debates, argued, disagreed, and then also tried to kind of formulate an analysis of how that material, that analysis related to their lives as Black women in Britain, you know, and then kind of looking at the traditions of, you know, the forms of media and writing that grew out of that. So, you know, you had the journals that OAD and Brixton Black Women's Group published themselves, Speak Out and FOAD. So very much in that kind of tradition of Outright, you know, that came later, that coming together to, you know, write a political kind of text, or kind of, you know, put out some kind of analysis or opinion, and then just like kind of stand outside Brixton Station and kind of give the journal away to passers-by. I think I read, I can't remember if it was Gail or someone else, but they were saying, oh, you know, it was supposed to be like 10 or 20p, but we most of the time we kind of gave it away for free. So I think that's really important. And then just also the very fact that when they were kind of coming together as a collective in, you know, kind of both examples, you can't find any names underneath any of the articles in any of those journals, because they were writing as a collective. When I talk to them now, like, you know, someone will be like, oh, actually, I wrote this one, and then this person wrote this one. But, you know, for them, what was more important than that kind of individualism of putting their name to something and kind of being at the forefront of something was coming together as a collective and speaking with one voice. Obviously, that kind of had its ups and downs, as any kind of movement does. But I do think that was a kind of very important organizing principle of the Black women's movement, kind of coming together, kind of working out those tensions together, and then putting something out that, you know, people that they were in community with could also, you know, relate to, disagree with, but ultimately be in conversation with and be in relation with as well.
Yeah, so I can't wait to read your book, Jade, because it sounds really like exciting and kind of meaty, that research, and I think that it's going to be a brilliant contribution. So I guess thinking, just going back to the book, the reissue of the book, and thinking a little bit about the oral history aspect of it. Obviously, Claudia Jones, A Life in Exile was in part based on a series of meetings that were convened with people who knew Claudia, who at that time were kind of elders who Marika Sherwood wanted to kind of make sure their voices and their experiences were captured for the record. And I just wanted to ask you, Jade, what it's like doing oral history work. What are some of the kind of excitements or pitfalls of that kind of work, and Lola as well, if you want to contribute?
Sure. Oral history, the highs and the lows of oral history, it's definitely been an adventure. I kind of came to oral history when I was doing my master's about 5 years ago now. And this is when I kind of first started to research the Black women's movement, and really wanted to kind of, you know, hear from the women themselves who were involved in the movement, and kind of really put their voices at the center of what I was writing. And, you know, once again, kind of hold those kind of tensions and contradictions and the messiness together in that kind of assemblage of voices. You know, since then, kind of embarking on my book project and speaking to kind of so many different women, it's definitely been an adventure. It's been life-changing. I started the book project by having conversations with my grandma, who is just incredible, just the best person in the world, and also has a really great memory. It's only, you know, sometimes when people ask me things that happened kind of last week or a couple of weeks ago, and I'm struggling, and I'm thinking, wow, like the questions I'm asking some of these interviewees, and they're digging deep and they're giving me this detail, like it's actually really a skill to, you know, kind of bring those memories and those experiences to life. My grandmother was a nurse in the NHS. She came to Britain in 1959 from Ghana. So, you know, I kind of started with her, started kind of talking about her experiences. And one of the things that I think oral history gives you is that kind of counter narrative to, you know, the kind of dominant history that we're taught or, you know, not taught either way. But, you know, there's a kind of dominant story of, you know, Black migration, Black presence. And like I said, I think it's kind of been over the past kind of 70 plus years, been kind of assimilated into this kind of bigger narrative of, you know, nation building and kind of forward marching and, you know, race relation acts and these kind of markers of kind of progress and multiculturalism. And, you know, kind of speaking to my grandmother and seeing the way that like her experiences directly kind of cut through that sort of dominant history, you know, it was just really, really interesting. So, you know, having spoken to her, I really wanted to kind of write a more kind of collective story or get a kind of collective idea of what was going on at the time, beyond just her experiences. So, you know, I've spoken to, like I said, 30 different women. Most of them were working class Black women. And, you know, they all have an analysis of their the conditions that they were kind of living in at the time. They all kind of have a historical kind of perspective on what was going on, which I think is really important. I think, you know, Black women are often, if we are kind of included in research, so to speak, where, you know, kind of subjects to the point of becoming objects. You know, we kind of come in to kind of reify a certain type of project or a certain line of thinking. And I think for me, it was really important to, you know, work in collaboration with the different women that I'm in conversation with. So, you know, I speak to them, you know, before COVID anyway, it was in person. In the pandemic, it's mostly been via Zoom. You know, I record the conversations, and then after I transcribe it, I actually send the transcript to them so that they can kind of look it over, add any details that they might have forgotten, you know, kind of take out anything that they don't feel comfortable being published. So I think that sense of just working together, not me having this sort of like authorial level of control over the material, has been really, really important in terms of the way that you know, in terms of like an oral history methodology, so to speak, and kind of trying to undo this, the authority that I think when you are an academic that you do occupy, but also, you know, at the same time trying to kind of acknowledge the fact that I am still the writer of the book. You know, I'm not going to disappear the kind of positionality that kind of, you know, bestows upon me or what that means. But yeah, oral history, I think another thing that has been really, really interesting is I kind of got used to this quite quickly, but you sometimes go into a certain kind of oral history experience expecting someone to say a certain thing or expecting a certain narrative from someone. And most of the time that does not happen at all. You know, people come out with all types of stuff, which is, but that, you know, that's actually the excitement. At first I'd be like, oh, I was really, you know, hoping for someone, you know, you kind of picked up a brick and you went out into the streets and you were fighting, but actually, you know, those everyday kind of modes of resistance, those times where you woke up every day and went to work and fed your children, are kind of just as important as those kind of big explosive historical moments. And I think that's been really important just to kind of, like I said, concentrate on the mundane, everyday kind of minor forms of resistance that typically go unseen, and that have actually, I guess, been part of a larger culture of dissemblance that Black women have kind of been part of, you know, since time immemorial.
Thanks, Jade. That was, amazing insight into the world of the oral historian. Lola, did you want to pick up on anything there?
I think Jade covered it so extensively. I think I really resonated with the point that you made about going into an interview expecting someone to give you something and their memory is just either filled with holes or it didn't happen in the way that you expect it. And I think that to me is confronting our own investment in a specific idea that history happens in a specific way, right? And that's really important when also thinking about major and minor figures, and also thinking about how temporality will shape who is important to whatever particular moment. And I think embracing the fragments that you get in terms of being a oral historian is also a good method for thinking about the current political moment, because often we can get caught up in this idea that the past, Claudia's past, for example, was great, and that her life was made up of these a series of these really significant events that don't somehow seem possible in a drawn out present. And I think when we, I guess humanize is the wrong word, but when we think more critically about how her life might have unfolded, we see the parallels. We see that nothing we are dealing with in this present moment it hasn't been dealt with before, right? We're at a different juncture with different tools, with different strategies, but the necessity for critique, the necessity to resist and defend remains the same, right? Across these things that we think of as kind of distinct temporal regimes, the past, present, the future.
Well, since you mentioned distinct temporal regimes, Lola, I'm gonna go on to asking you a little bit about your new book, Experiments with Imagining Otherwise, which feels like kind of, I think it feels kind of like maybe crystallizes some of these things that you're talking about in terms of bringing this kind of critical lens, but through experimentation with form, which I think is so exciting. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you think poetry or experimentation with form and language can offer to a revolutionary movement.
I love this question. I think that for me, when I think about poetry, I think about those poets who made their political commitments clear. So I think about someone like June Jordan, for example, her like essay on her going to Nicaragua. I think about how she wrote about the first and second Intifada. Like I think about the capacity for poets to break open our affective and emotional landscapes, right? To make us truly believe that, you know, what has been withheld from us under hegemonic regimes is not only possible, but we can reach out and act as if it, you know, as if we could take it. I also think about something that Jackie Wang said of like poets being the kind of timekeepers of a revolution. They can add a rhythm, they can add something that enables, that gives a texture to the things that we experience. And there's a way that, you know, people can become too reliant on poetry and not enough on material and analysis of material conditions and resistance. But I think what the argument that I was trying to make in Experiment, hopefully through form, is that both are necessary. We need ways of recording, ways of remembering, ways of being with each other interpersonally that show us transformative relations are possible, even as we live under regimes of dispossession and regimes of kind of extraction, even as we feel a kind of crushing powerlessness in a contemporary moment. And when I think about that, I think about how I began that book with a quote from Claudia. And she says, I think it's like, it seems like I knew you long before commentaries of conscious choice through under single skies, those of us who, fused by our mold, became their targets as of old. And I think that like Claudia's poetry has that flavor. It has that, you can see in it her commitment to other people, her belief in fraternity, her belief in that kind of ethical relation. And I think maybe one of the reasons why that element of her political work is often forgotten is that people they make a distinction between art and politics, as if such a distinction exists, right? As if culture is not the domain of those two things. And so for me, what I see when I, in the book, read like snippets of her autobiography or little fragments of her poetry are these kind of written promises and these written attempts to touch people across borders, to examine the world as it is, and then to say there's more, and I'm going to try and articulate what that abundance might look like textually, and that to me is the most threatening poetry. It's the reason why when you look at her, letters to people in prison, they're extremely, in my mind, extremely kind of romantic, because they're preoccupied with the question of what could the world look like, what could be, which I think is a central question that all radical poets in some way are asking.
Amazing. It makes me think of Pat Parker's poem Woman Slaughter, which we used to use at the Sisters Uncut demonstrations, which talks about kind of gathering together with crowds of women to spill the blood of men who commit woman slaughter. And it's really powerful. And I feel like there are those poems that are like rallying calls that they're kind of like the lifeblood of a movement. If they're in the moment in which they're produced, they can be so potent and much later. I wanted to invite people in the who are watching, participants, attendees, to start putting questions in the Q&A box, because we will be taking questions quite soon. Jade, is there anything you wanted to come in on that last point?
I really kind of love the idea of, poetry, art, beauty, all being like, really important parts of a kind of a radical politic, of a kind of, Black radical tradition. I think so often those elements of resistance and rebellion are kind of seen as unserious, and I think that's kind of why Claudia's poetry, or her kind of role as a poet, as an artist, has been erased, for lack of a better word, in terms of her kind of, the story, the kind of agreed upon story of her organizing and her activism. I think speaking to so many of the different women that I've spoken to over the past 3 years now, one of the, I didn't realize when I set out to write the book that it would be so central, but one of the kind of key staging grounds for, I guess, a kind of, renegotiation of like power relations and gender dynamics and sexuality and all these different things has been the dance floor historically, within kind of Black communities. I, speak to different people and they mention like a song that kind of is evocative of like a certain memory or a moment or an era, a kind of a memory of dancing in someone's arms, that really spoke to the kind of political commitments of the time that they had, and how I guess the dance floor was maybe a precursor for going out into the streets, or to kind of coming together and having like a reading group, or whatever that looks like, kind of forming different modes of relation outside a kind of more dominant hegemonic white gaze. So yeah, I just kind of, I really love the idea of kind of art, of beauty, of sex, of all of these kind of things that are seen as frivolous to kind of a movement history, actually being really integral to how we understand freedom and what a world in which we can kind of do those things freely might look like.
Thanks, Jade. That makes me think of the Steve McQueen Lovers Rock film that was on the BBC, and just that long, slow scene of dancing in a house party. And I thought that really reminded me of what you're talking about. A question has come in for you, Jade, from Pauline. Pauline asks, so interesting, Jade, what has been most rewarding and challenging about engaging in this research beyond the structuring and deadlines of book publishing, and how has it changed you? Brilliant question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Pauline. Okay, most rewarding has been, just people kind of being so generous with their time and kind of really embracing me and the project that I'm kind of working on. You know, people invited me into their homes, they made food, we'd sit over like cups of tea. One woman at the end of the conversation gave me a huge bottle of like homemade sorrel that really tided me over for that weekend. So just, these kind of different forms of like being in community with people. I think in the academy, you're taught to, carry out academic research, especially oral history, in a very specific way. It's supposed to be kind of very distant, very, you're supposed to kind of, pretend at least to be whatever people feel is an objective kind of person. Obviously, an objective position does not exist, but you're supposed to kind of affect that sort of positioning. And when you are speaking to these different women, you realize you really cannot kind of be going into people's houses and kind of sitting there really rigidly and not, actively engaging in the conversation. So I think what has been really beautiful is kind of, putting down the tape recorder and just letting the conversation flow and seeing what comes up, trying to let go of those kind of, the preconceived ideas that I had of a certain kind of history or story. And, as Lola was saying, a certain investment in a certain kind of story, trying to kind of just free myself of that and let the story go where it goes, and kind of follow it round that way, has been really beautiful and has kind of really led to some kind of really interesting moments that I did not expect at all. I won't talk too much about it because I will go on forever, but, just kind of people saying things and having experiences that I just hadn't even entered my mind that someone would be kind of navigating those things. And then kind of sitting down with them afterwards and being like, oh, actually, this is, a really important part of their story and it needs to be down as part of this larger history that I'm trying to weave. I guess the difficulties, there's been so many. There's been so many. I think one of the most difficult things at the beginning, not necessarily now, but was kind of just trying to honor those kind of fragments and those silences. I think, so often there is that desire to kind of have this complete and whole narrative. And I kind of had to, at a certain point, mourn all the things that I would never find in the archive, all of the people that I would never meet, all of the stories that I would never be able to collect. But then, after kind of having that period of kind of mourning those kind of lost connections that I was seeking, trying to kind of see the other kind of potential for, those gaps, or what it means to maybe just for those gaps to exist. I kind of had to, I guess, make peace with the idea that there are also certain reasons why certain histories have not been narrated. There are certain reasons why certain people are not part of certain histories. There are certain things that cannot exist in certain forms. I am writing, a trade book. What does a certain type of history under, of people that are still under surveillance, who are still living under forms of like state predation, what does it mean to actually say, okay, maybe we did have this conversation, or maybe I didn't meet this person, and actually for that form of resistance and rebellion to kind of, go on in the way that it needs to go on, I can't document it for just anyone to read. And then I guess the second kind of difficult thing is just, ultimately, I'm writing about people I love. I'm writing about people I have so much respect and regard for. And people have really gone through some awful stuff. I think, Black women have really gone through it in this world and are still going through it. So having to sit with all of the really, really horrible things that, in terms of the way the world is currently organized, Black women are made vulnerable to, is really difficult to kind of face every single day. I've had, stretches of time. I think my longest kind of writing block was for about 2 or 3 months, where I just actually couldn't write anything because, the weight of kind of having to live with those stories was a lot. So I think that's why kind of, taking my time and having kind of slowly written it has actually been the kind of most healthy mode of trying to write the book. I think so often there's this demand for productivity, for deadlines, for like getting things out. And I've been really, really lucky to have so much support where people are like, actually, you take your time, sit with this, and when it comes, it comes. So that's been really beautiful, just to be able to like sit with the voices, sit with the stories, and figure out how, for people who have experienced so much harm, how do I not contribute to that harm with what I'm trying to do? How might this be a mode of redress? How might this be, a way for these women to, just speak their shit and say what they need to say, without having to kind of be plugged into this like larger, grand narrative. So yeah, I think just kind of sitting with the voices, understanding and listening for silences has been really, really, really important to the writing of the book.
Thanks, Jade, for sharing that. And I think it's so important to remember all of that, really, the huge weight that you're describing, that you're carrying as part of doing this work. There's another question here from somebody in the audience, S. Tonsi, who says, thanks again for this. My question is, how do we weave the individual into collective without falling into the trap of overgeneralization? Thank you for that question. Lola, how do you feel about this question? I think I can put it on.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I'll give it a go. I think that I guess what the question is pointing to, or at least like what it makes me think of, is the times that we live in now. I think we're living under, a neoliberal regime. We're living under a regime that is really invested in kind of isolating and alienating us as individuals, where the kind of there's a lot of competition between not only businesses but people for resources, rather than a more communal approach or a more collective approach that would see that the world could be organized in a way in which ideas of scarcity or ideas of having to fight over resources were kind of impossible. And I think what the idea of kind of overgeneralization here is quite interesting, because it makes me think about that thing that Jade said earlier about how so many of the materials written by these groups don't have individual names to them. So maybe generalization, maybe a kind of broad sweep in which it's impossible to pinpoint individuals, is something that the Communist Horizon is promising us, or is something that I think maybe Claudia lived her life knowing, or lived her life trying to kind of embody. I think not being afraid of overgeneralization or not being afraid of the individual merging into the collective is really important and central, I think, to feminist ethics of care. We've seen even in this moment, we've seen over the pandemic, as we saw the state kind of abandon people in a mass way, it was grassroots collectives, it was mutual aid networks, it was anti-raid networks that kept people alive, safe, that kept people able to access specific resources. And those groups thrive on precisely on collectivity, not being able to be named as individuals. And maybe there's a tendency in the current moment to prioritize, celebrity or individual kind of ascension within, organizing, within research, within publication, especially that culture exists within academia, this idea of like the genius idea or the star concept. And I think what's more interesting to me, at least, as a political strategy, is that plurality, is that inability to really reduce something to the one person it came from, if it did come from one person, because in lots of ways we're all made up of each other. that was my attempt to answer the question.
That was
Sorry.
brilliant. I know, I love that, and that idea of relationality and thinking about how we're really connected to one another and constituted by one another, maybe could be a point for the audience member to think about. So thank you for that question. We have another question here from Jacob Joyce, who asks, considering the cancelling of Notting Hill Carnival, I'm assuming that is, due to the pandemic, what do you think is at stake if we are not able to bring that kind of space back into existence?
So I really like that question, because I think it really speaks to another question that I've just seen in the chat, where someone is saying, you know, Claudia Jones has been kind of sanitized, but how might we understand, you know, Carnival as a kind of radical response to the 1958 Notting Hill riots, and kind of what that has meant. I think a lot is at stake if, you know, people aren't able to kind of gather in the streets every August in the way that, you know, we have for, well, since the Notting Hill riots of 1958. I think, you know, we've kind of had this kind of conversation about art and the importance of, the importance of like poetry, the importance of art to any kind of radical movement. And I really kind of love that quote that, you know, sometimes kind of comes up from Claudia, where she says, a people's art is the genesis of their freedom. I think the Carnival has been so important to a history of kind of disobedience and rebellion in this country. I just yesterday was writing about the 1976 kind of Notting Hill riots, where, you know, protesters kind of fought back against police harassment and brutality. I think the Carnival has always been, you know, just like the dance floor, a site of like people kind of coming together, you know, different forms of relation kind of, you know, kind of being born in different ways, and obviously a celebration of Caribbean cultures at its heart. So yeah, I think it is important that Notting Hill Carnival comes back. I'm sure it will when hopefully the pandemic slows down. But I think it has been integral to, organizing in this country, a sense of rebellion and a kind of ongoing legacy of rebellion. I was reading Ronaldo Walcott's recent book on property a few days ago, and he was kind of talking about the, you know, riot rebellion as, you know, being directly part of this kind of genealogy of like, you know, slave revolt, slave rebellion, and kind of fighting back against kind of hegemonic forms of you know, predation, of harm, and of like state sanctioned neglect. So I think just kind of understanding Claudia's role in that as not just this kind of neutralized mother of Carnival, but as someone who was, you know, again, engaged in a kind of variety of political projects. And the Carnival was another manifestation of an ongoing lifelong political commitment to so many different people.
To that also, I would add, what's at stake is also thinking about how the state has used the pandemic as a means to not only shut down those spaces, but thinking about how Carnival began. I think also what's really incredible about this book is it charts how some of the proceeds from the very first carnivals went towards paying people's fines. And we can see, you know, if we are to be critical, how maybe elements of Carnival have moved from those kind of radical traditions towards a more kind of commercial arena. And so what's also at stake is the possibility to bring it back, but bring it back in a different way, or at least to bring it back keeping that criticality in mind as it becomes even more important in terms of a moment where many of us are relying on each other in order to survive, so that the Carnival, so that Carnival doesn't just become a space to kind of practice an unbounded freedom, it also is materially connected to resistance against policing or resistance against the state. And those interventions can look like, I don't know, rethinking how we might infuse political education into Carnival, even in terms of its history, giving out leaflets, giving out, things to passers-by that enable them to understand that they're not just at a commercial party, they're at something that has a militant history, or at least in part was conceived by a militant. And that's also kind of, I think, what's at stake as well.
Thank you both. That was really brilliant answers. There's another question in the chat from Sim. Thank you for this space this evening. I was wondering if you could speak on how Claudia somewhat drew upon her experiences of exile and imagined understandings of her situation to create community and transform realities. Yeah, either of you want to come in on that?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? You're muted.
That's happened once. The question is I think about whether Claudia's experiences of being exiled from the US informed the way that she worked to create communities.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that when hopefully people get a chance to read this book and for those who aren't already familiar, look more into Claudia's life. I think being exiled, but then as Jade pointed out, also not being able to travel and being, extensively, I think at any given time, we have to remember that there were multiple threats on Claudia's life, from the state, from fascists, from, a lot of people who understood the threatening nature of the work she was doing. And so I think carving out community was a way to respond to that, was a way to find kind of safety in numbers. And I think for her, a way to demonstrate that her political commitments didn't end with the nation, that there were communities that she knew she was connected to, regardless of whether she had been born in this country or not. I think it's particularly pertinent in a contemporary moment where we're having conversations about the differences between experiences in terms of the Black diaspora. And I think that Claudia's life is a huge example of how you might make connections even from a place that you aren't quote unquote from, right? How community needn't be how people needn't think about it as a kind of stringent idea, as an idea that's contingent on a specific set of factors or biological realities or whatever, that it's capable, that it's possible to create the conditions for community that not only keep you safe, but also extend your political project outwards from where you are.
Amazing. Jade?
Yeah, I think Lola said it all. I guess the only thing that I would add is I kind of really love the way, Claudia's, well, maybe love is the wrong word, but Claudia's lived experiences were, kind of directly informed her kind of political commitments, but at the same time, I don't think it ever, how would I say? I'm not sure if subsumed is the right word, but she understood herself in relation to a community. She was part of a community. So those lived experiences, were kind of one part of a wider political analysis. And I guess I find that particularly important at the moment because we're kind of having discussions in feminism, Black feminism in particular, about this idea of like lived experience, how much can lived experience stand in for like this, larger kind of analysis of material conditions that, you know, different communities are living through. And I think Claudia speaks to the way in which, you know, lived experience can directly inform a collective politic, but is also not the limit of that collective politic. You know, there are so many kind of other ways of being in relation with people. You know, we've got someone who was an internationalist who, you know, who, like I said, couldn't travel, you know. So I think Lola's spoken to the ways in which, you know, Claudia's organizing, her writing allowed, you know, those forms of relation to travel beyond, you know, borders, to kind of put people into relation with one another beyond this idea of a kind of atomized, you know, nuclear, you know, idea of kind of family or community. And, you know, that undoes, I guess, a kind of a national or a nation building project, you know, something that exists outside this idea that we're all supposed to kind of exist in these like privatized, cordoned off like families. You know, we work forever and we produce in certain ways, all to kind of, you know, I guess, support and reproduce the state and state formations. I think what Claudia's ideas and kind of, you know, I guess theory in the flesh, in terms of how she kind of went about forming community is really important when we're talking about a kind of more contemporary idea of an international politic. I think so much of, I guess, and it would be, is a mainstream conversation about this idea of like being Black in Britain is about, it kind of folds back into this national narrative, you know, getting certain rights, you know, kind of petitioning the state for certain forms of recognition, kind of becoming a kind of subject citizen in certain kinds of ways. And I think that, you know, Claudia and so many of the people that she was in community with undo that sort of narrative and kind of give us an idea of the different kind of ways that we can live beyond these borders.
Okay. I want to head towards wrapping up. I thought we could maybe take one more question. How do you guys feel about that? Yeah, okay. Because we've obviously all got lots to do. So there's a question on the parallels you can choose. There's a question on the parallels between Claudia and Una Marson. Quite interesting. Thinking about the realities of their lives and deaths. So that's in the chat, if you want to have a look. Or there's a question about individualism and whether communities can unite around a central point. So up to you, which one you guys want to take? Lola, I'll start with you.
I think I will go for Chanel's question in terms of communities. So the question, obviously everyone can see it, sorry, I'm just reading it for my own sake. Do you feel that communities can unite around a central point, or we're going too far down the road with owning labels? I think that for me, what's been really interesting in researching Black women's kind of radical formations, or radical formations just on the left, is this question of unity, which comes up so often. And when we think about Claudia's life and how she was able, I think a huge part of her work was around this idea of mass mobilization. I think what she was able to do was mobilize hundreds of people around specific ideas or events. And that seemed to be something that was not only something that created pressure, but something that enabled for also mass kind of political education. But I would push back on this uncritical idea of unity, because I think so many of the people, when we think about the left, I guess, in my mind, there are so many different kinds of lefts. There are so many political genealogies at any given time vying for preeminent, or like vying for their strategies to be taken on board, because they have this idea of how the world should be. And so often people, I guess, get themselves into this linguistic trap to say we are too fragmented, we are too, et cetera, et cetera. But when we look at how movements get narrativized, they become unified only in retrospect. I'm sure at the time, a lot of the work that Claudia was doing felt scattered, felt fragmented. I'm sure she felt isolated, in terms of like linking up with other Black movements and organizations in the UK. And so I don't think it's as simple as, individualism versus unity. I think there is a way that splintering, fragmentation is both useful and incredibly sometimes demoralizing. But I think it's not that if we all became unified, we would have more power, because I think that there's a difference between being able to mobilize on a mass scale and what people can think unifying is. Does that mean that everybody has the same political vision? Does that mean that there is no tension? There's no space for fight, for debate, for etc. I think, I'm quite skeptical of ideas of unity, because I've seen how in the archive movements that we think and see as like threatening and unified were behind the scenes incredibly fragmented. And so for me, an embrace of fragmentation with the principle that mass mobilization is incredibly important at any given time, alongside political education, is where I'm kind of at with that. Maybe that'll change. I don't know.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, when you do begin to approach these kind of narratives in the archive or in different forms of literature, there is this idea of this kind of very neatly, united movement, which, wasn't fragmented at all. There weren't dissenters, there weren't people who disagreed, there weren't people that even had beef, because there definitely were. I think that's important. That is part of the movement as well. I think for any movement to, I don't want to use the word be successful in that sense, but I guess for any movement to mobilize on a mass scale, everyone has a different part to play. I think those parts are really important, but they don't necessarily have to come together for people to mobilize on a grand scale. When I was doing, I guess, the first oral history, and I was speaking to women who were involved in OAD and who were organizing in Brixton Black Women's Group, they were very active in the Brixton Defense Campaign, which was a kind of campaign of different kind of, leftist groups in the aftermath of the Brixton uprisings in 1981. And you had, people with so many different kind of political leanings, and sometimes, they were in kind of direct opposition to each other, even in that space on the left. But, you kind of talk to them and they say this, organizing with this sort of person was difficult. They were organizing with people who, were kind of explicitly anti-feminist at times. And it was difficult. So I'm not trying to kind of fetishize that experience. However, what was important for them, especially in that moment of emergency, was kind of a form of solidarity that allowed them to mobilize on a mass scale, and kind of occupy these different parts of the movement, but, kind of be on the ground for people who are being arrested, people who are being beaten up, people who are being literally ripped from their houses in the middle of the night by police, kind of them being there paying fines, I guess holding the state to account in different ways was really important, but they weren't unified in the kind of typical sense that we understand unity. So yeah, just to kind of basically echo Lola's thoughts, I think, that in those fragments, there's a kind of, I guess, insurgent ground for a different type of kind of political action, a different type of solidarity.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good place to close. Thank you so much to Lola and Jade for joining us today, for your brilliant insights, and to Housmans for hosting. Please do head to Housmans to buy a copy of the book, Claudia Jones, A Life in Exile, and thank you so much for joining us. Keep your eyes peeled for other events in our Radical Black Women series, and have a great night. Thanks very much, everyone. See you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.